The mockery of iron. Emperor Vexnar of the Quilfax Dominion stood aboard the observation deck of his flagship, the Eternal Radiance, as the primitive human vessel approached. His 4 eyes narrowed in contempt, multifaceted irises reflecting the distant starlight as they focused on what the humans called their state-of-the-art diplomatic cruiser. They dare approach us in that. Vexnar's voice resonated through his thoracic chamber, the bioluminescent markings along his exoskeleton pulsing with disdain. A vessel of crude metals and archaic propulsion systems. Chief Science Advisor Zyril moved to stand beside her emperor, her own markings glowing a cautious blue. The humans have only achieved interstellar travel within the past 60 cycles, your luminance. Their technology is rudimentary. Rudimentary. Vexnar scoffed. That is a generous assessment. Look at their hull, composed of processed planetary minerals welded together like a child's puzzle. Our living crystal vessels are grown from the quantum foam itself. The Quilfax had ruled their sector of the galaxy for over 10,000 years. Their biotechnological mastery had produced living ships with crystalline nervous systems, vessels that could heal themselves and adapt to nearly any space phenomenon. The entire species had evolved beyond crude physical tools, their bodies containing specialized organs capable of manipulating matter at the quantum level. First Admiral Krenvac approached with a formal bow. The human delegation requests permission to dock, your luminance. They wish to discuss a mutual defense treaty against the Void Harvesters. The humans believe they could assist us against the Harvesters. Vexnar's secondary arms trembled with barely contained amusement. What could these primitives possibly contribute to our defense? They claim to have encountered and survived a Harvester scout ship, Krenvac replied. Their persistence in requesting this audience has been remarkable. Very well. Vexnar gestured with a fluid movement of his primary right arm. Let them dock. Their presumption amuses me. Perhaps observing true civilization will humble them. The human vessel, designated as the UES Tenacity, docked with all the grace of an injured herbivore. Vexnar watched through multiple sensor feeds as the delegation made their way through the crystalline corridors of his flagship, their environmental suits clumsy and bulky against the smooth pulsing surfaces. Ambassador Diana Chen led the human group, accompanied by Captain Malcolm Rivera and Chief Engineer Dr. Aiden Nakamura. Vexnar studied them as they were escorted into the grand audience chamber, noting their soft bilateral symmetry and their complete reliance on manufactured equipment for survival in the ship's crystalline atmosphere. Welcome to the Eternal Radiance, Vexnar announced, his translator converting his crystalline tones into human speech. I trust our atmospheric accommodations aren't too discomforting. Ambassador Chen bowed slightly, her expression professionally neutral despite the wonder visible in her eyes. Your Luminance, we are honored by your hospitality. The Quilfax Empire's achievements in biocrystalline technology are legendary. Yes, Vexnar agreed, settling his massive form onto his living throne. Though I imagine much of what you see appears as sorcery to your species, Captain Rivera shifted uncomfortably in his environmental suit but remained silent. Engineer Nakamura, however, seemed fascinated by the pulsing walls, his eyes darting from one crystal formation to another with undisguised curiosity. Before Chen could respond to the subtle insult, proximity alarms screamed through the chamber. Science Advisor Zyril rushed to a nearby interface panel, her markings flashing urgent patterns. Your Luminance, Void Harvester signatures detected, massive spatial distortions approaching through metaspace. The viewing wall erupted with impossible colors as reality itself tore open. Through the breach emerged ships of absolute darkness, geometries that violated physical laws, surfaces that absorbed all light and reflected nothing. The Void Harvesters had arrived far sooner than intelligence had predicted. The unknown vessels immediately opened fire, their weapons bypassing the flagship's crystalline shields as if they didn't exist. Impossible. Zyril screamed as systems began failing throughout the ship. They're using metaphasic disruption fields we haven't encountered before. The flagship shuddered as more hits landed. Vexnar watched in horror as his mighty vessel's crystal structure began to fracture, lines of dead black spreading through the living walls. The human delegation, however, was already in motion. Rivera had his communicator out, barking orders to the Tenacity. Engineer Nakamura was pulling equipment from his pack, setting up what looked like primitive scanning devices. "Your luminance," Chen called out, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We encountered similar weapon signatures 6 months ago. We developed countermeasures that might help." Vexinar's pride warred with his survival instinct as another blast rocked the ship. His entire bridge crew looked to him, awaiting his decision. Finally, he inclined his head. "Proceed." Rivera nodded grimly. "Tenacity, execute Protocol Omega. Transfer shield modifications to the Quillfax flagship." What happened next would forever change Vexnar's view of humanity. The Tenacity, that ugly, primitive vessel of welded metal, moved to intercept the next attack. Its shields, modified with what the humans called phase inversion technology, absorbed the harvester weapons. Meanwhile, Dr. Nakamura worked frantically with Zyril, explaining principles that somehow merged biocrystalline technology with human innovation in ways the Quillfax had never considered. "Your crystal matrices are harmonically entangled at the quantum level," Nakamura explained, fingers flying over his equipment. "But that's exactly why the harvester weapons are so effective. They are targeting those entanglement patterns. Our technology is too crude to utilize quantum entanglement, so we developed phase inverters that intentionally create quantum disharmony." Zyril's markings pulsed with sudden understanding. "Disharmony as a defense. We never considered such an approach. It violates all our technological principles." Sometimes, Rivera added as he monitored the battle, "primitive solutions work precisely because they're unexpected." As the immediate crisis passed and the harvester ships retreated, Vexnar found himself looking at his human guests with new eyes. The Tenacity had sustained heavy damage protecting the eternal radiance, its metal hull scored and breached in multiple locations, and yet it continued to function. "Your vessel," Vexnar observed, his tone containing a hint of genuine curiosity for the first time. "It appears severely damaged, yet your crew continues operations." Rivera smiled slightly. "Humans have been repairing damaged ships since we first put boats in the water. Your luminance. We don't need our vessels to heal themselves. We've become rather good at healing them ourselves. Your technology is inefficient, limited, crude." Vexnar began, then paused. "And yet, it saved my ship today. Perhaps there is something to be learned here." Ambassador Chen stepped forward, her expression carefully diplomatic. "The Void Harvesters are a threat to all spacefaring species. Your luminance. We may lack your technological sophistication, but sometimes a different perspective offers solutions that advanced civilizations might overlook." The Emperor's markings pulsed thoughtfully. "What do you propose, Ambassador?" "A true exchange," Chen replied. "Not just an alliance, but a technological and cultural exchange. We invite you to send representatives aboard our vessels, to witness how we operate, to understand how we think." First Admiral Krenvak's markings flashed with outrage. "Your luminance, surely you wouldn't consider." "I would," Vexnar interrupted, rising from his throne. "I will go myself. If these humans can defend against harvesters with ships made of processed rock and primitive alloys, I wish to understand how." Dr. Nakamura couldn't suppress his excitement. "We could integrate phase inversion technology with your biocrystalline matrices across your entire fleet." "And I," Vexnar announced, his 4 eyes fixed on the human engineer, "will see firsthand how creatures who build their vessels from dead matter, rather than growing them from living crystal, can possibly stand against the void." As preparations began for the Emperor's unprecedented visit to a human vessel, Vexnar gazed out at the damaged Tenacity. Its ugly metal hull, now scorched and battered, somehow seemed different to him, less primitive, and more resilient. These humans, with their welded metal and mechanical engines, had survived where his perfect crystalline technology had failed. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to these creatures than he had assumed. The Symphony of Stars. Emperor Vexnar had never felt so undignified in his 900 years of life. Crouched in the narrow corridors of the human battlecruiser UES Defiant, his secondary limbs folded uncomfortably against his thorax, he watched the human crew navigate their vessel with surprising efficiency. 3 standard weeks had passed since the Harvester attack, and the joint human Quillfax fleet was preparing to strike back. "I apologize for the cramped quarters, Your Luminance," Captain Eliza Jang said, leading him toward the bridge. "Our ships were designed for human dimensions." "Evidently," Vexnar replied dryly. Unlike his own vessel, where corridors and chambers would reconfigure themselves to accommodate different species, the human ship was a maze of fixed metal passageways, rigid and unchanging. The bridge of the Defiant was a sharp contrast to the crystalline elegance of Quillfax command centers. Stations were crammed with displays and control interfaces. Humans sat before them, fingers dancing across panels, voices calling out reports in a cacophony of sound. It seemed chaotic, inefficient, and yet, somehow, functional. "Your command structure appears disorganized," Vexnar observed as Captain Jang took her chair. Jang smiled. "It might look that way, but there's a method to our madness. Human decision-making works best with multiple inputs and perspectives." Science advisor Ziril, who had accompanied her emperor, studied the nearest console with undisguised curiosity. "These control systems are entirely mechanical and electronic. No neural interfaces, no quantum entanglement. We work with what we have," Lieutenant Commander Rashid explained from his tactical station. "Humanity hasn't developed direct neural interfaces that we trust in combat situations. Sometimes buttons and switches are more reliable than thoughts." "Approaching the Cygnus Rift, Captain," the navigation officer announced. "Harvester activity detected along the perimeter." Vexnar moved closer to the main view screen, his bioluminescent markings pulsing with anticipation. The fleet, 5 human vessels and 3 Quillfax ships, was about to enter the region where the Void Harvesters had established their primary base in this dimension. "All vessels, combat formation Delta," Jang ordered. "Ready phase inversion shields and prepare metaphasic countermeasures." The human ships moved with surprising coordination, forming a protective screen around the more powerful but vulnerable Quillfax vessels. Dr. Nakamura had succeeded in adapting the human phase inversion technology to work with the biocrystalline systems, but the integration was still imperfect. As they approached the rift, the sensors detected massive energy fluctuations. The view screen showed space itself beginning to warp and distort. "Harvester emergence detected," Rashid called out. "Multiple signatures, larger than any we've encountered before." The void ships materialized like nightmares given form, massive constructs of non-Euclidean geometry that hurt the eye to look upon. They immediately began firing metaphasic weapons that tore through conventional space. "Evasive pattern Omega-3, Jang ordered calmly. "Execute countermeasure protocol." To Vexinar's amazement, instead of the elegant coordinated movements of a Quillfax fleet, the human vessels scattered in seemingly random directions. The Defiant itself executed a series of sharp, jarring maneuvers that sent the Emperor stumbling. "What is this?" he demanded, steadying himself against a bulkhead. "Your vessels are breaking formation." "Unpredictability," Jang explained, gripping her chair as the ship shuddered under a near miss. "The Harvesters use predictive algorithms to target their weapons. We found that random, human-guided maneuvers confuse their targeting systems." Vexnar watched as the human tactics unfolded. The vessels regrouped in constantly shifting patterns, never maintaining the same formation for more than a few moments. Each captain seemed to be making independent decisions while somehow maintaining coordination with the larger fleet. "Your Luminance," Ziril said urgently, "the human defensive strategy is working. The Harvesters are unable to concentrate their fire effectively." A massive blast rocked the Defiant, sending sparks cascading from overhead conduits. The bridge lights flickered, and several stations went dark. Direct hit to decks 3 through 5, Rashid reported. Hull breach contained. Shields at 42%. Reroute power from secondary systems, Jiang ordered. Get those shields back up. Vexnar watched in fascination as the human crew responded to the crisis. Unlike his own people, who relied on their ship's self-healing capabilities, these humans were actively repairing their vessel even as the battle raged. Crew members rushed to damaged sections, bypassing systems, rerouting power, sealing breaches with emergency force fields and physical patches. Your ship is badly damaged, Vexnar observed. In a Quilthax vessel, we would withdraw to allow the crystal matrix to regenerate. With respect, your luminance, Jiang replied, eyes fixed on the tactical display. We can't afford to withdraw. Every ship is needed. Another hit rocked the vessel. A console exploded near the engineering station, sending a crew member flying backward. Medical personnel rushed to assist, while another officer immediately took the injured human's place. You continue to fight in a failing vessel? Vexnar asked, genuinely curious now rather than condescending. As long as we have weapons and engines, we fight, Jiang said simply. Humans have a long history of making do with damaged equipment. The battle continued for hours. The human vessels took damage that would have crippled Quilthax ships, yet they continued fighting, adapting, repairing, compensating. What they lacked in advanced technology, they made up for with sheer tenacity and improvisational skills. When the Defiant's primary weapon system failed, they reconfigured auxiliary systems to create a makeshift targeting array. When shield generators overloaded, they'd rotated the ship to present undamaged armor to enemy fire. When communication systems were damaged, they reverted to ancient radio signals and visual codes. As the tide of battle slowly turned, Vexnar found himself genuinely impressed. These humans, with their crude technology and fragile bodies, refused to surrender to superior forces. There was something admirable in their stubborn persistence. The decisive moment came when the Defiant and 2 other human vessels executed a daring maneuver, diving directly toward the largest harvester ship. Their shields failing, their hulls breached, they nevertheless launched a coordinated attack that overwhelmed the enemy's defenses. Now, Jiang ordered, deploy the phase inverter bombs. The weapons, a hybrid of human explosive technology and Quilthax crystalline control systems, detonated inside the harvester's dimensional field. The massive void ship began to collapse in on itself, its impossible geometry folding and twisting until it vanished in a flash of anti-light. The remaining harvesters, faced with this unexpected defeat, retreated back through their dimensional rifts. As the human crew cheered, Vexnar turned to Captain Jiang. I have misjudged your species, Captain. How so? Your luminance? She asked, still monitoring the damage reports flooding in. I mistook technological simplicity for evolutionary inferiority, the Emperor admitted. I failed to recognize that adaptation often arises from limitation. Later, as Vexnar stood in the Defiant's observation lounge watching repair crews in spacesuits working on the hull outside, science advisor Ziril joined him. Your thoughts, your luminance? She asked. Our perfect crystalline ships, Vexnar said slowly, are indeed marvels of advanced technology, but they have made us inflexible. When our sophisticated defenses fail, we have no secondary strategies. When our living ships are injured beyond their self-healing capacity, we cannot improvise repairs. He gestured toward the humans working outside. Look at them, using simple tools to mend complex damage, using their hands and minds to compensate for technological limitations. Their very weakness has become their strength. What will you tell the Dominion Council? Ziril asked. That we have much to learn from these humans, Vexnar replied. Not despite their primitive technology, but because of it. Their ships may be made of dead metal instead of living crystal, but they have something our vessels lack, the adaptive intelligence and determined spirit of their creators. As the Defiant limped back toward Earth, its hull scorched and patched, its systems jury-rigged and barely functioning, Emperor Vexnar of the mighty Quillfax Dominion found himself experiencing an emotion he had never expected to feel toward these primitive humans: respect. The Emperor, who had once ridiculed humans, now stood among them, watching the stars pass by through their simple viewports, and recognized that true advancement came not from perfect technology, but from the will to overcome limitations, a lesson his ancient civilization had long forgotten. The mockery of iron had become a symphony of stars, and Vexnar was listening.